Today on Contentment, we are joined with Jason Padilla with the Lincoln Zen Center. Our topic today is Buddhism. And from what I've seen, many Americans really seem to like the idea of Buddhism without fully understanding what it means to align with its principles. I'm hoping in this hour you can begin to help myself and others like me understand what it truly means to practice Buddhism and meditation, how you've come to call yourself a Buddhist, and how you found contentment alongside this way of life. Thank you so much for meeting with me today, Jason. Would you like to take a few moments to introduce yourself and the Lincoln Zen Center before we get into our discussion?
Yeah, so my name's Jason Padilla. I'm a student at Naropa University. I'm studying the Master of Divinity program in Buddhist Studies, hoping to one day be a chaplain and a Zen priest. And I'm a member of the Lincoln Zen Center. I'm a part of the board. I'm the Education and Outreach Coordinator. And yeah, I'm happy to answer and help people understand more about my spiritual tradition and see what else they have questions on.
So how long have you yourself been involved with the Lincoln Zen Center?
I'm new to Lincoln, so I moved to Lincoln in it was 2017, I think, late fall. So I joined the Zen Center probably towards 2019, right before everything started getting locked down.
Okay, really?
Yeah.
Well, I feel a good place to begin discussing Buddhism is probably from its own beginnings. I'd like to touch on a few foundational concepts before moving on to how one might use its principles from day-to-day life. So, could you begin to describe to me who was the Buddha?
So the original Buddha lived roughly 2,600 years ago. He was a prince in India. His birth was very auspicious. You know, there's lots of signs and portents saying that he was going to be somebody important. And a seer at the time, Lord Ashita, he said, you know, he's either going to grow up and become this great spiritual leader, or he's going to become this king and emperor of like this vast domain. And so his father, you know, king himself, said, well, I think I'd rather have him be a king. So he steered him away from anything religious, you know, he grew up in this very pampered lifestyle. But it wasn't enough. He still figured out, you know, people are dying, people get sick, people experience suffering. And so it led him on this journey to become closer to the truth of whatever the universe is. So he started this long path and journey of different practices. You know, he starved himself, he walked on coals, he did all these sorts of abusive mortification sorts of practices and didn't find any answers. And then he remembered as a child that meditation was something that was really close to his spirit, close to what he could consider a state where he could find more truth. So he practiced meditation for a long time. And, you know, there's many myths and mythologies around what he experienced, of course, overcoming Mara, the evil one, and fighting the battles and, you know, finally arriving at this realization, this enlightenment moment where he discovered everything to be, you know, what it is. You know, he arrived at what the truth is. And so with that realization, he took those teachings and started spreading them to others. And many people started following his way of life, which is largely, it's called the middle way. So it's a balance between the two extremes. One extreme being like these extreme practices of like starvation and beating yourself and starving yourself or hurting yourself in some ways to realize spiritual truth. And then the complete opposite, which is utter indulgence, you know, just completely giving in to the everyday life, consumerism, materialism, all those sorts of extremes. So he advocated for something in the middle.
And so if meditation did not begin with the Buddha, do we have any idea when the practice came into being?
It's a very deep question. So Buddhism is not the first tradition to introduce meditation. At that time, there was many different traditions going on in India. There was the precursor to modern Hinduism. It was Brahmanism, and it followed these teachings called the Vedas that were passed down through the priest caste system, you know, the Brahmins. And they also had different types of meditation that they would use to connect to the gods. Also around during that time, around the Buddha's lifetime, was Jainism, which is another different spiritual tradition, very similar to Buddhism, advocates for nonviolence, also has its own types of meditation. And then the yogic Hindu tradition, they've also developed their own. So it seems like many spiritualities throughout the world, you know, even Christianity has centering prayer and meditation.
Yes, yeah.
So it's hard to ask and answer, where does it come from? It seems like it's sort of this human trait to connect to people by slowing down and finding what else is happening.
Discussing all these early religions, was the Buddha himself considered religious, or did he consider himself religious? And then, is Buddhism itself considered a religion, or more of a way of life?
I think that depends on the context. The Buddha himself, he dedicated his life to teaching others about his truth, what his findings were. So you might say that early Buddhism was more of a practice of life rather than the way we treat spirituality today, which is just an aspect of one's life. He really wanted people to become monastics, give up all your worldly possessions and really enter in this lifestyle, this whole life of spirituality, committing to meditation and living the way by the Eightfold Path. So I would consider him to be pre-religious, maybe, is a good way of describing it, where your whole way of life is built into that sort of philosophy. Nowadays, I would say that more people are considering Buddhism to be a religion. It doesn't answer the way other religions do all the questions about where did the universe come from, what's behind the veil, what happens when you die. It has some answers to these questions, but it doesn't answer all of these. It's more concerned with how you're living your day-to-day life rather than what happens after.
Well, then I suppose, could you please clear up some of the confusion I have on where Hinduism begins and where Buddhism ends? Because for a lot of concepts, like such as karma and dharma, in my mind, there's a lot of overlap, at least from my Western perception.
So during the Buddha's time, Hinduism was the biggest religion. That was the most widespread across the Indian continent. And it had different belief systems. One was that there was this intangible sort of God quality of the universe, this Brahma. And the only ones that could connect to Brahma were the Brahmins, the priests. And that was a caste system. So you were born into this family, you passed it on to your children, and then continued onward. The belief system there was that hopefully by doing the right rites, the right initiations, the right rituals and ceremonies, your soul, your being could transcend this life and move into the cosmos where it could be one with Brahma. Buddhism is largely a critique of that system.
Really?
The Buddha really thought there was some fundamental flaws with this, and he didn't necessarily agree with everything that was being presented. Many people think of him as a reformer of religion at the time, and I don't really think that was his goal. His goal was trying to help people as best he could. And having a caste system where it says, only these people are privileged and these other people are not, wasn't really conducive to his way of understanding life. So he taught people regardless of caste. He said, if you're in the highest caste or in the lowest caste, anybody can accomplish what I've accomplished if you dedicate your life and your way of doing things to it.
I'd love to touch more on that when we start discussing reincarnation, but I have a few more preliminary questions to get to. First, could you please describe the relationship which the Dalai Lama has to Buddhism? Who is he, and who do Buddhists view him as?
So there's different sort of faith traditions within Buddhism. Buddhism's like this real big umbrella blanket, just like you would have Christianity.
Yeah, exactly.
So there's two different styles of Buddhism, basically. There is the Theravadan Buddhism, which is the Buddhists that practice mainly in Southeast Asia, Sri Lanka, Thailand, Burma, and these are the most traditional. They follow the sutras, the early teachings and texts, pretty closely. They follow the path that's been laid out by what we believe to be the original Buddha's words. So that's one sort of branch. And then the other branch is what's known as Mahayana Buddhism. And Mahayana Buddhism is a word that means the greater vehicle. And these are Buddhists that practice for the benefit of other beings. Their goal is not to become enlightened, the way it is in traditional Buddhism, but actually just to gain enough insight to help other people become enlightened. So the goal is to help everybody, all places, all times, to rid the world of suffering. And that's more of what that spreads out into. So with Mahayana Buddhism, there's two different pathways. It really spread into Tibet, and then it spread into China and all across East Asia. In Tibet, this is where the Dalai Lama comes into play to answer the question. There's four basic different schools of Tibetan Buddhism, and the Dalai Lama is the head of the Gelugpa school. So there's four different sort of schools, but he is just the most well-known figure in Buddhism.
Well, then I suppose a misconception I had was that he himself was viewed by certain people as the literal reincarnation of the Buddha.
In the Gelugpa belief system of that school of Buddhism, they view him as sort of the avatar or the incarnation of one of the bodhisattvas, one of the spiritual beings. They view him as sort of the messenger of Avalokiteshvara, the hearer of the cries of the world, the spiritual being of compassion. So he is highly realized. He probably is a Buddha.
Mhm.
I have no way of knowing, and
Yes.
he would have no way of telling us. But he is a very important teacher, and even though there's differences among the schools, many Buddhists, whether they're Tibetan Buddhist or not, still look to his teachings for guidance.
Then can we speak a little bit about the whereabouts of the Buddha now? If he's currently not on Earth, where did he go after his passing?
So when the Buddha became enlightened, he entered a state that many people may be familiar with, which is called nirvana. So there was this state of mind that he entered in, which was it's nirvana. Many people believe this to be like Buddhist heaven, and that's not quite right. So nirvana is the state of where you're no longer suffering. You're no longer burdened by sickness, by death, by aging, by anything in the world that's going to hurt you. And he did that by deeply concentrating in a meditative state, and he realized what the truth of all phenomena are, all the truth in the world. And that was a nirvana with remainder, because he just didn't suddenly transcend into the cosmos.
Yes.
So he was still alive. He taught for a long time. He was around 30 or so when he became enlightened, and so he had this ministry of going out and teaching all these different people, different groups, and spreading his teachings for 50 years. He died approximately 80 years old. So when he died, he is said to have transcended his body, and he wouldn't be reincarnated anymore into another being. So that would be the nirvana without remainder. So he's sort of like in the Mahayana teaching, he's in the cosmos as the cosmic Buddha.
So are there any texts that were put together during or after his life of his teachings, either by him or his disciples?
So it was interesting at the time. So at the time of the Buddha's life, this was pre-literate. The only people that were writing things down were the Brahmins. They're the only ones that had access to learning and studying Sanskrit. And even then, most of the teachings were transmitted orally. So you'd have to spend years and years and years with a teacher memorizing all of these texts perfectly so that you could, give them to the next person going down the lineage. So at the time of his life, none of these teachings were put down in writing. It was only after a very long time afterwards, probably 400 or 500 years, that they actually started to write these things down. So there's a lot of mythology around that. Ananda, who was the Buddha's attendant, like his secretary and he took care of the Buddha, was said to have this perfect photographic memory. So everything that the Buddha said, Ananda memorized. And if you read any of the sutras, that are known to be closely attributed to what the Buddha would have actually said, there's a lot of phrase that says, "Thus have I heard at one time the Blessed One, the Buddha. The Buddha was staying at such and such a place with this many monks." That phrase, "Thus have I heard at one time," is usually, we attribute that to being Ananda, writing down this message. So yeah, there is not any real teachings that were recorded verbatim by the Buddha. He didn't write anything down. This was just not done. But the oldest collection of sutras and texts that we have is called the Tripitaka, and it means the three baskets. So this would be the most traditional Buddhists. The Theravadins would have this as their sort of sacred text collection. And the first basket of texts is called the Vinaya, and that would be basically the history of Buddhism, the life of the Buddha, and also all the rules that a monk needs to follow for life. The second collection is called the Sutras, and these are all the different stories and meetings and parables and teachings that the Buddha gave throughout his ministry, 50 years in India. And then the last basket is called the Abhidharma, and the Abhidharma was compiled after the Buddha died. And basically it was 500 or so of his disciples. They sort of came together and sort of synthesized what the Buddha was teaching into sort of lists and understandings about what the universe is.
There are so many concepts that I really want to expand on, and I hope traveling through the stages of life will serve as a great platform for you to do so. So I suppose, I'd really like to begin with speaking about reincarnation and kind of the purpose of life itself.
Yes, so reincarnation, I think, is largely misunderstood in Western American sort of understanding. People think like you have this soul and then you die and then you're reborn as like something else, and that maybe if you go to a psychic or somebody, they could tell you like all your past lives. Right?
That's exactly what I got.
Well,
interesting.
There's sort of this understanding that this is this is a Zen Buddhist Mahayana understanding, as that's the locus that I'm part of. That we're a stream of mind. So that might just take a minute to sink in, but there's not necessarily a soul per se in Buddhism. It's more of an understanding that this is not so much a spirituality than it is more maybe a psychology. So your body is temporary, but your mind keeps going through all these different stages, and when you pass away, your mind is sort of in between stages. And when it finds a place that it can connect with, that's where it decides to land. And then wherever that is, depending on all the past actions that you've had in your life, it might put you in a place where you would be reborn as a person. It might put you in a place where you might be reborn as an animal. So it just depends on a lot of factors, and a lot of those are not explained. It's up to all your past actions, which they would call karma.
Mm-hmm. Well, then I suppose I would want to ask, what is our role here on Earth with taking all these incarnations, and how might we attempt to break free from them?
Yeah, so that's exactly what the point of reincarnation is, because, and I don't mean to take offense to anybody that's Christian, but, in a sort of a Christian understanding, you have this one life, you have to live it as best you possibly can, and depending on your tradition, you're either determined to be in hell or in heaven, so there's sort of a linear understanding that once you're done, you have two destinations, and there you are forever.
Yeah.
In Buddhism, it's sort of like you have unlimited do-overs. You keep living this life, and the world is sort of trying to bring you to wake up, to understand what your purpose is. And it does that by giving you as many tries as it takes for you to really understand it. So for the Buddha, he would say that, you have a precious human birth, which is very rare considering all the different varieties of species of animals and bugs and plants and materials that are out there in the world. You need to use it well, you need to use it wisely. So you should be dedicating your life to serving others and being compassionate and kind and doing as much as you can for others in the world. That way, the world is a little less horrible and there's a little less suffering, and hopefully that helps you go on to a future rebirth in a better space. Eventually, like him, if this is your goal, you can break free of that. You can understand the way the world works and break free of that and transcend this wheel of rebirth and death.
Could you help me to understand what might be the worth in being reincarnated as, say, an animal? I mean, is that viewed as a punishment by any chance?
It might be a blessing. I mean, sometimes if you're in a war-torn area and suddenly you die and the only safe way of getting out of there might be a flight as a bird, maybe you'd be reborn as a bird. So there's a lot of factors and determinations that we don't understand. It's said that only a Buddha can understand what karma and factors that have been in the past determine someone's path today. It's not, karma and rebirth are really misunderstood in the Western imagination. Karma, people tend to think that it's sort of this reward and punishment system, and really it's more of a cause and effect. So if you touch a hot stove, you get burned. Like, the stove isn't punishing you, it's just letting you know that it's hot, and your understanding is from the burn. So it's not so much that you've been punished by touching the stove, it's just that you have a new understanding what the stove is.
Interesting. A few times now you've said a Buddha. Are you saying that there are more than one, or does Buddha just refer to an enlightened being?
Buddha refers to an enlightened one.
Okay.
It means one that has been enlightened. Some traditions translate that as one who is awake. There was 7 Buddhas before the current Buddha. And these Buddhas existed in worlds and times, eons before probably our universe even began. They define these as kalpas, and they're like these innumerable billions of eons. It's just like this enormous amount of time that has passed. And it's said that the next Buddha will arrive when all of the teachings are lost. So it might be, if there's a world apocalypse, or, whatever happens, that there's a next sort of cropping up of life wherever it is in the universe, that might be at the next spot for the Buddha. Now, in the Mahayana tradition, there are multiple Buddhas. There's Amida Buddha, who has a realm called Sukhavati, and there's various traditions. I think it's the Shin tradition in Japan. It's more devotional. It's actually much like Christianity, where you pray to Amida Buddha, and by praying to him and offering him your good works and your good merits, you're promised to be reborn in his land, where you can be, whatever it takes, you can become enlightened.
With this kind of prophecy for the Buddha, am I still to understand that anyone could become enlightened at any time by taking the correct actions?
Yeah, he didn't promise anybody like a guaranteed timeline.
Yeah.
But he did say anybody can become enlightened. Anybody can become a bodhisattva, which is an enlightened being, or a Buddha. And it might take as short as 7 days, but it might take 7 years. It might take 7 lifetimes. But you really have to commit to the practices and the teachings. And for many traditions in Buddhism, that would require going to a monastery and becoming a monk or a nun.
That idea of going to a monastery, I do find very romantic, renouncing the material world. But I really can't see myself ever acting on any of those feelings, and I know a big part of me wouldn't want myself to, at least in this incarnation of mine. This physical world can be very, very painful, but it can also be very, very appealing. So I guess my question would be, what might be the role of someone who wants 1 foot in the mystical and 1 foot planted on Earth? How would they best use this specific incarnation of theirs?
So in the early tradition, around the time of the Buddha was actually alive, and in Theravadan Buddhism, the traditional Buddhism, it's sort of cut and dry. You're either part of the laity, you're either a lay person, and you are providing for the monks, you go and listen to teachings, you do your best to live sort of in the life of being an ethical and good person. And then, hopefully, throughout your different lifetimes and reincarnations, one of them is ready enough to become a monk. And then once you become a monk, hopefully you do as much as you can to become enlightened and then transcend. In Mahayana, it doesn't matter as much. Lay people become teachers, lay people become enlightened. There's a sutra called the Vimalakirti Sutra, and in it, Vimalakirti is just like this normal guy. He just hangs out at different places in the city, and he tries to spread the teachings, and he's highly enlightened. He's highly realized. And so he teaches all of the disciples of the Buddha, and he comes and he's teaching a little bit about what the Buddha is saying, and it didn't really matter whether he was a monk or not. It was just sort of that he had all these lifetimes of accumulating all this wisdom, and he was willing to help spread it. So There is ways of being in both worlds, but it's a difficult path because the appeal of materialism is very strong,
Yes.
and sometimes I think that's where we make some mistakes. And not that the spiritual lifestyle can't be material. I mean, there's a lot out there in the world where they're selling yoga instruction. You have to buy the fancy meditation cushion. You have to buy these certain texts. You have to, subscribe to this enlightened magazine. Like that exists in there too. But what is important is things you really shouldn't have to buy very often.
Yes.
So.
Before continuing, could we jump back into the Eightfold Path, which you mentioned earlier?
This is part of the Buddha's first teaching. When he became enlightened, he was part of this group of ascetics, these wandering monastic sort of spiritual beings, these people that were practicing all these horrible things. And they saw him he took food. He was starving, he was dying. This young girl thought he was like this forest spirit because he just looked so terrible. He looked like a skeleton and he was probably filthy and dirty. She's like, oh, it's a tree spirit. I'm going to just give him the food and then run away. So he ate this food because he knew he was on the last.
Yeah.
He was just in the cusp of death. And they were like, oh, he's given up. We're going to move on. So after that, the Buddha became enlightened. He found this five group of friends that he had before, and he gave the first teaching. And in it, he talks about the Eightfold Noble Path as part of the Four Noble Truths. So Four Noble Truths are, I like to make it a little pithy. This is sort of the Zen explanation.
Yeah, please do.
In life, there is difficulty.
Mm-hmm.
Oftentimes we hear life is suffering. That is an understanding that's part of it, but in life there's difficulties. I mean, there's no way of getting around being sick or dying or getting old or seeing things, that you love just be taken away from you. That's just part of life. So that would be the first noble truth. The second is, there is a cause of our suffering, and the cause of our suffering is sort of twofold. It's basically that we're ignorant about our craving, of our wanting these things. And even when we say, well, I don't want sickness, that wanting to not be sick is still a craving.
Mm-hmm.
The wanting of good health and good life for as long as possible, it's still a craving. Whether we look at it as a push or a pull is, irrelevant. It's still sort of a craving. The third noble truth being that there is a way out of all this suffering. And that leads to the fourth noble truth, which is the Eightfold Path. And the Eightfold Path is the answer to how do you end suffering in my life. And he describes it as 8 different ways of looking at things. So it's the right way of looking at things. And he goes into more detail, but it takes a long time to understand the breadth and depth of each one of these things. But it's right view. How do you view the world? How do you view yourself in it? Right insight, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, and right concentration. Or right meditation. I think I only got 7 in there.
Oh, you fooled me. Well, then I suppose then it's time to jump into meditation. Wherever you'd like to begin, I know it's such a large subject to begin discussing.
So I belong to what's known as the Soto Zen school in English and in Japanese, and that basically is the meditation school. Our practice at the Zen Center is meditation. There's other things that we do there. We do some book studies and text studies that I lead, and we listen to Dharma readings or different talks by different teachers, but most of what the practice is meditation. And the reason why it's so important is because it falls back to that story about the Buddha. He realized enlightenment through meditation, so it's sort of been this practice that's been handed down throughout the different schools of Buddhism. And what it is, it's sort of an embodiment of what the teachings are. So many of the teachings are non-harm, don't harm other beings, no matter if they're big or small or tiny or they're bugs or they're, whoever it is, just try not to harm them. And really try and work on yourself, as much as possible. Try and cultivate a sense of compassion, a sense of courageousness, a sense of wanting to help others. So the way that's largely practiced is through meditation. There's different styles of meditation. There's ways of practicing with just what is in the present moment, sort of the mindfulness meditation that's very common today. But there's also like loving kindness meditation, where you meditate on all the different people that are around you, those that are real close to you, all the animals that are in your life, all the spouses, pets, family members, brothers, sisters, friends, and then you go out further. You might meditate with loving kindness on strangers that you don't really know, but you see all the time, your worst enemy, like all the different creatures and critters that are out there in the world. So it's a way of really practicing what the teachings are in a way that makes sense, and because so much of the tradition is based in psychology and the mind, that's where you practice, is how do you change the world, is by changing how you think about the world.
How often would you usually recommend people meditate, and for how long?
I would love to see people meditate every day.
Yeah.
And even if it was just for 5 minutes, that would be wonderful, because it really allows you to slow down and examine your situation. And sometimes you'll have great insights. You might realize, oh, I could have been totally wrong about that situation and made things much worse.
Mm-hmm.
I should have said this instead. Well, that's fine. You might have nothing going on. Your 5 minutes might be totally blank, where your mind is racing the entire time. But the point of it, after a while, is you just learn to slow down. And slowing down is so important, because then it allows you enough space to give yourself moments of clarity and ways of dealing with situations more kindly and compassionately. Now, different traditions have different ways of teaching meditation. Eyes open, eyes closed. Do I look at an object? Do I look at the wall? Do I have, music going on? What all is needed? So it would take probably a whole episode to talk about the different styles.
Yeah. I'm most familiar with the practice of mindfulness myself. Could you please give an explanation and maybe how to practice that for those unaware?
Many people have this idea that you need to sit in a certain posture, cross-legged, lotus position or half lotus, and none of that really is that important. What is most important is that you're, for sitting meditation, for zazen, you find yourself in a place where you can sit upright and comfortable. It doesn't need to be a cushion. It could be a chair. It could be on the couch. But it's that so that your feet are planted on the ground and that your back is upright. If you're sitting on a chair, it would be away. And really what you're doing is you're concentrating your attention on your breathing. So things will start coming and going in your mind. You'll remember something, you'll start thinking about such and such a thing. You'll be like, oh, I need to pay that bill, or, oh, I wonder what I'm going to have for dinner. Like, that's just all part of it. What you do, what the practice is acknowledging that's happening, and then when your attention gets away from that, you come back to the breath. That's basically it. It's just really coming back to the breath. And you don't need to breathe in any certain way. You don't need to time your breath to any sort of rhythm. It's just whatever your natural breathing is what your breathing is. And you just sit for 5 minutes, just as much as you can, putting your attention back on the breath. And then when it's over, you just sort of reflect on how did that go? What was going on? The most important part of that reflection is being gentle with yourself, because nobody's ever going to do this perfectly. If you can do it perfectly, then you're a Buddha. And you probably, should be teaching other people. But if your mind wanders. That's perfectly normal. It's perfectly fine. So being kind and gentle with whatever your practice is, however it turned out, is important. That's probably the most important part, is be kind. Be kind to yourself with your practice.
Yeah. It's so hard, I find, to find the balance, and also I'm very new to the practice, but it's hard to find the balance of letting your mind wander, like accepting those thoughts and not attaching to them, and being drug around with them rather than like seeing them float by.
Yeah.
It's very difficult.
It will happen. You'll just be sitting there and all of a sudden you're in the middle of like some fantasy about where I won the lottery and this is what I'm spending all the money on. And when you remember that, that's a small moment of waking up. You're like, oh, I'm meditating right now. That's a small moment of waking up. And then you don't even have to do anything with that fantasy. You can just, let it go, let it be wherever it was, and just remember to come back to the breath. There doesn't need to be any judgment like, oh, I'm such a bad meditator, or, oh, look, I did it. I'm such a good meditator. None of that matters. You just let all that go. You just come back to the breath.
So meditation is really where I'm to gather that waking up comes from?
So it does. It boils down in different traditions in different ways. Sort of in the classical Zen, in the Rinzai school. This is Zen that comes to us from China, the oldest of the Zen traditions. Their goal is to have this moment of awakening, right? This, like, the brilliance of the universe just impacts you all at once. And you suddenly are like totally different. You're like a different person. You're still yourself, you still have your own personality and everything else, but your understanding is different. You suddenly understood like what things are like. It's like, having been blind your whole life and suddenly now you can see in color, and it's like, totally different. And Soto Zen, the idea is everybody has Buddha nature, so you're already enlightened. You don't need to do anything extra. So the meditation process is to come back to what your Buddha nature is. And the way we do that is meditation. And it strips away all the superficial stuff that we think about ourselves. And we let go of all of our understanding, our thinking, our constructs, whatever we view the world to be, good or bad. However, you just release all of that. And whatever that meditative state is enlightenment. The teacher, the founder of Soto Zen, Dogen Zenji, his way of describing meditation was practice enlightenment. It's a practice of enlightenment.
Especially in today's world, there is so much materialism. It's almost like we're trained not to have any. It's like we're trained in the exact opposite of what Buddhism is, or at least the practice of meditation. It's like if you have 1 second where you're not looking at something or thinking of something or doing something, consuming something, you're doing something wrong. And here are like 1,000 apps that you can download to fix yourself.
Yeah, exactly.
And so it's such a hard thing to find time in the day. Because I've done it before, and I feel almost like, what's wrong with me? I'm wasting time. I should be doing this and this. I guess, do you have any advice for people who are struggling with that, who do want to find spirituality or peace, contentment, but it's so hard because it's been ingrained in us ever since we were little to consume?
Right. Well, I would say that at any moment in your life, whatever is coming up in your life, you have a relationship with it. So you have some free time. So you and free time have this relationship, and some people have this tendency to want to fill it up. I don't want free time. That means I'm lazy, or it means that I'm this, or it means that I'm that. So when you do have those moments of free time, I would say examine what your relationship is with that. Sit with that for a little bit and see what that feels like. Do you like it? Do you not like it? Do you wish you could change something about it? That right there is a moment of mindfulness. It's a moment of understanding like what your situation is. And when you can appreciate that moment for just being what it is, not what it's lacking, or not what you could fill it with, or not what you want it to be instead, that's really powerful. It's just finding a quiet moment to just look at something the way it is and not wanting to change it at all.
Jumping back a little to the overall purpose of life, and I know we've discussed that to answer some of these questions, it may take a Buddha to truly say what's right. But is there any reason given that we know why we must wake up in the first place? Why was our consciousness not already enlightened in the beginning?
Well, there's a twofold sort of path to answering that question. So traditionally, they would say, you're lost in this cycle forever. You're like a wheel that's spinning out and it's never getting anywhere, and you're like burning up, and you're crying like, throughout all your lifetimes. It said that you've filled an ocean up with your tears, and that, through all your lifetimes, you've filled an ocean up with the spilled blood that people have, they've killed you. So it's to escape all the suffering. The world isn't so great.
Yeah.
So people want to, when they realize how terrible the world actually is, they really do want to transcend it. The other aspect of it, and this is sort of the Zen Mahayana teaching, is that you already have everything in you to become awake. There's certain schools that think of this, this Buddha nature that's in you as a seed, and sort of you cultivate it, and then suddenly it flourishes and you are enlightened. And other traditions are like, no, it's already ready. It's like a piece of gold that's covered in like oil and grime and dirt and stuff. It's like it's all there. You just have to like brush away all these ideas that you're not perfect off. And there it is.
Following that mindset of we might be gold covered up, could the event ever occur that an enlightened one may be pulled back into the material world and be recovered? I guess, does it go both ways?
Yeah, so the Buddhist tradition, the texts are pretty clear that once you have understood something, right? Once you have seen whatever the mysterious understanding is, you can't unsee it. So there's no way of slipping back in.
Yeah.
Now, that works in sort of a twofold way. It means that the Buddha can manifest sort of cosmically, but not materially, if that makes sense. So he can teach us through all these different ways and all these different experiences, but, his time on earth is up. So that's sort of, but the understanding of like you can't slip back.
Yes.
There's never been a Buddha that's like fallen from grace.
Okay, interesting. Interesting.
Yeah.
Going back to the 7 Buddhas at the beginning of time, as you said, and I'm really just trying to get a firmer grasp on the idea of reincarnation here. But were our streams of consciousness present at that time as well, all those lifetimes ago, even theoretically before our own universe?
Yeah, they consider this is known as the Soha world, our universe. And those other 7 different universes before, they may have been connected. They may have been just sort of paralleled. But it's likely that we were part of those universes before.
Interesting.
In some sort of fashion.
We're speaking so much of other beings. Just for fun, for a second, can you tell me your thoughts on aliens?
So, in Buddhism, it's not dismissed.
Yeah.
It's totally plausible. It's like, what makes us feel like we're so special with this, particular set of circumstances where we're just the right distance from a sun, we have enough life and water and materials that can cultivate life. I mean, that can happen. If it happened once, it's likely to happen anywhere.
Yes, yeah.
So, classically a Buddhist would say that hopefully those worlds will have a Buddha that will come and will give those beings teachings.
Interesting. Yeah.
In the Vimalakirti Sutra, he performs, Vimalakirti, the layperson, he just performs all these different miracles to show like how skilled and enlightened he is. And one of them was he could reach in and he could pull these universes close for people to look at. And one of them was a universe of just smells. It was all scents, all perfumes. And the Buddha that was teaching there, he's like, what kind of world is this with these forms and things? It looks so difficult to teach people. Like, how do you teach people? And of course, the Buddha, Shakyamuni, our Buddha on this planet, he's like, it's very difficult. You have to teach with words, but their understanding's deeper. And, the scent Buddha, he's like, it's so easy. You just teach with perfumes in this universe. So, yeah, I mean, anything goes, really.
Interesting. I'd really love to have a whole episode just on meditation, but I suppose we should go on now to some other life practices that are, or might be tied in a way to Buddhism. And I suppose I'd love for you to touch a little on yoga. I myself, like my previous misconceptions of Hinduism, fail really to see where the two separate and come together.
Yeah, so I would say that yoga and Buddhism are sort of sister traditions. At one point, they have a lot of overlap. The word yoga means to yoke. Like when you're putting an animal in front of a carriage, you put that yoke on their neck, that harness, and it joins them together. So yoga is like to join things together. And in the yogic tradition, which is basically a form of Hinduism, you're doing these postures, these practices, these rituals to join yourself together with Brahma, with this God sort of principle, or with a God, and sort of realize spiritual truth that way. In Buddhist tradition, they also refer to yogis and yoga, but they're really joining it with their practice. The meaning is different. Yoga in a Buddhist tradition would mean like you're practicing meditation, basically. And the connection, what you're joining yourself with, is direct experience. What is the world? What is the experience? What is my mind sort of telling me right now?
What do you think about America's perception, and I would imagine a lot of the Western world, of yoga now?
It's very commercialized. It's lost its spiritual sort of presence. It's more of like you're doing it for health purposes.
It seems more like a workout routine rather than a spiritual practice, yeah.
Exactly. And, I think that if you really are serious and you enjoy yoga, you should study it some more. In that way, it's not so much of a Western American sort of appropriation of one culture and using it to the benefit for me in another. It's sort of exploiting a really rich and brilliant spiritual tradition and getting what you want out of it and throwing away the rest. I would also caution people to, really look into it and see if it matters to you, because it's part of a really rich tradition, and it would be respectful for people to really understand the depth and breadth of it.
Yes. I'd love to dive a little into temptation and materialism. And I know you discussed briefly the concept of Mara earlier, but could you please go a little more in depth on who that is to Buddhists?
In the sutras themselves, Mara is this character, and he's known as just the evil one. So we don't really know where or why or how he comes into being. There's not a whole lot of background story like Greek mythology about like where the gods came from. It's sort of they're just there. And sort of the understanding of Buddhism is like we've always just been here. It's more of a circle rather than this linear point of start. So Mara, he's known as the evil one. He was basically, he was present when the Buddha was trying to become enlightened. So he's sitting under the Bodhi tree, pre-Buddha, Siddhartha. And Mara, the evil one, is sending like all these temptations to sort of like break his concentration. So he sends like these beautiful women, and that doesn't work. So he sends like gold and diamonds and, all these fanciful things, all this, fantasy rich stuff. That doesn't work. Then he finally like is threatened and feels like, well, if I don't have evil, like what can I do with my worldview, So he sends like this horde of demons, this, vast army that's going to go and crush the Buddha. And, the story goes that the Buddha was unmoved. He didn't flinch, he didn't blink, he was just sitting there in concentration, and when they started shooting arrows at him, they would turn into flowers before they would reach the Buddha. It's sort of like this really grandiose mythology going on here. And the Mara's like, well, who's your witness to say that you've actually achieved enlightenment? And the Buddha touches the earth and says, the earth is my witness. The earth has been here all along and knows what I've accomplished. And that, of course, like shattered everything. Mara disappears, and he understood everything, and he became enlightened. So that's sort of the mythology around Mara. He does appear from time to time in the sutras. Often the Buddha will be thinking, he'll be in meditation, and these thoughts come up, and they sound a lot like self-doubt. And like, when we sit down and we think about things we've done or things we've said, and we sort of beat ourselves up psychologically. And all the Buddha necessarily has to say is that you, Mara? Are you the one giving me these thoughts? And then, boom, he's gone. He's just sort of expelled. So, on one hand, you sort of have like this, like he's the villain, the anti-Buddha, and he's sort of the antagonist of this story. And then, at the other hand, you sort of have this psychological understanding that Mara is part of us. We all have a Mara in us that's sort of like the one that points the finger at us and tells us we're not good enough in whatever fashion that looks like. And once you can see through all of this facade, it's just thoughts. and you can be kind to yourself and kind to Mara, actually, it sort of disappears.
So does the Lincoln Zen Center take the tale of Mara more literally or figuratively?
I would say, this is so the difference between sort of more doctrinal teachings of, let's say, Christianity, where they're like, here are what we believe in, and this is what the whole church believes in, and, this is sort of the understanding. Buddhism's more personal.
Mm-hmm.
So different people will believe different things. I'm sure there's some people that are like, no, Mara is a real entity. He's like this evil that exists in the world, and we have to follow the Eightfold Path so that we can get away from Mara. I personally view Mara as sort of being the psychological aspect, our shadow selves that are ourselves. And I would say that probably many people at the Zen Center would find that to be true for them, is that it's sort of like your anti-self, your psychological shadow. So, yeah.
Might perpetual consumption of the material world, or materialism in general, might it go hand in hand with self-doubt?
Yeah, they can. I mean, there's nothing wrong with having material things. Like if you have a nice laptop, or you have a phone, or if you have a good car, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with having things, because then you get into like, what should I be doing with my things? Do I give them up? It's like having things is okay, but it's like this uncontrollable hunger for needing more things. That's the problem.
Mm-hmm.
Materialism is like we were discussing before, it feeds you this line of psychological questioning and doubting about yourself so that you need more things. Because as soon as you have like the basic necessities, what more do you need?
Mm-hmm.
And that doesn't make a good economy. Like they're not making millions of dollars of profit unless you're constantly hungering for more stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not really the stuff per se that's evil or bad or not so good, but it's more that the hunger and the need for things, like this longing, this desiring, this constantly like saying that you're not good enough, is what is problematic.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a different understanding, sort of in Christianity and Western mythology and understanding spirituality. People have sin, and it's like you're this tainted, coded sort of evil thing, and these actions are bad, and you're just like, no, you could get in a lot of spiritual trouble for doing such and such things. In Buddhism, it's more open and kind about the understanding. It's that you're going to make mistakes.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's inevitable.
Yeah.
Everybody's going to make mistakes. It's learning from your mistakes and sort of having this understanding that you can recover and you can make yourself better. So even with materialism and that constant hunger and craving, and you're like wanting to consume all these things, and then you're beating yourself up. Well, that beating yourself up is what's really punishing you.
Mm-hmm.
So the understanding is you're going to make mistakes. There isn't really a notion of sin. There's more of a notion of like, well, now what are you going to do with this situation?
Your analogy with the hot stove, I think, sums that up very, very well.
Yeah.
I love that. Do you think that to overcome the excessive need for more, we may need spiritual fulfillment, or do we need to learn to overcome this excessive need in order to allow that spiritual fulfillment into our lives?
I think it's a little of both. I think some people naturally, they're drawn sort to a tradition, a spiritual tradition, or a faith. And if it serves them well, I think it's a good place to be. I'm not saying that all spirituality is going to be helpful. Sometimes you enter a practice, or you're using spirituality as a crutch to ignore the problems in your life. We would call that spiritual bypassing,
Mm-hmm.
You don't want to deal with the abuses in your life or the situation that you find yourself in, so you turn to prayer. Well, that's helpful, but you really have agency in your life to do more than just pray. So, you can use it meaningful, but you also have to use it in a way that's also wise.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say that with materialism, with, all of this constant barrage of stuff that's thrown at us, the way that I understand it, the way that the Zen tradition sort of understands it, is you work with it the way you do with meditation. You see all these things and you become aware of all these things and you study them. You become very familiar with them. You practice with them the way you do studying your breath with meditation. You put your attention on it. You see that there is this hunger and this need. You might go back and say, well, remember when you bought that thing and it was great for like 5 minutes, and then after that it was just sort of there.
Mm-hmm.
And then, you evaluate that. You say, well, going back to the Dalai Lama, is this, if I do this thing, if I get this thing, if I have this experience, who is it benefiting? Is it benefiting me or is it benefiting others?
Mm.
And that's sort of a way of understanding it. It's like when you practice meditation enough, you realize, this present state of mind, working with this present state of mind in a kind, compassionate way isn't any different than your everyday life. Mm. And you can use meditation as sort of the training ground to make good decisions in your life.
Returning for a moment to meditation, I wanted to cover briefly those emotions of ours which may be perceived as negative. What might the use be of them from the viewpoint of a Buddhist, and how might we go about dealing with them?
So with my teaching and understanding of meditation, emotions are part of the experience, right? This is part of your human experience, and they aren't things like you want to throw out. Right? People often go into meditation and they're like, I'm doing everything you're saying, I'm following my breath, and I'm still angry, or I'm still frustrated, or I'm still depressed, or I'm still whatever it is. And it's like, well, how are you working with that? Is my question. It's like, when these things come up, how are you working with that? And they're like, I try and push it away. And it's like, well, why are the more you push it away, the bigger it gets. Repression is not a healthy way of working with things. Instead, you just become familiar with it. So, for example, it's anger. I'm sitting in meditation and anger comes up. I have this lousy coworker that gets me in trouble a lot because, we're on this team together and they make me look bad and they don't know what they're doing. Whatever it is, that is already a storyline. You start, focusing more about all the circumstances about the anger than actually looking at the emotion itself. So with meditation, the process is, you come back to your breath and you notice what the anger feels like. What does the anger feel like? Before you start taking off on this long story about how it's your coworker's fault, where is the anger in your body? What does it feel like? Does it feel red in your face? Do you feel like tension in your hands? Do you feel like a tightness in your gut? And then that's where you stay. You come back to your breath, and then you go back to the sensations in the body. And we often work with the body because, unlike the mind, it doesn't spin fabrications, right? Your sensations in your body are genuine, usually. So with emotions, it's not so much that you're like transcending them, getting away from them, like moving them aside, you're becoming like this special spiritual holy person. You're really becoming friends with your emotion. You become very familiar with what anger feels like. And then once you become familiar with what anger feels like, you understand how it works. And when you understand how it works, it's very easy to just let it go. The anger is still going to be there. But now you don't have to blame your coworker and explode. The next time you go into work, you can be like, they're doing that thing again. And then instead of exploding and like making it feel like it's their fault and diffusing, throwing the blame on them so you can get rid of this feeling, you might find a way of working with it. And working with just the anger, or working with your coworker to help maybe diffuse the situation better.
I know we've discussed the Dalai Lama briefly, but are there any other, I suppose you could say, religious authorities, maybe in the West?
It varies. In Buddhism, there's not sort of like a system of like popes and bishops and archbishops and cardinals, sort of like the Catholic Church style. It's, the Dalai Lama is sort of the figurehead of Tibet, and he's the head of the Gelugpa school. But really, he's not like in charge of like this system. He's just a figure person. He's the teacher of the school. But there's all these lamas and rinpoches and all these enlightened people that are they're coming below him, and they're teaching their own students. So rather than it being like a systematized hierarchy, it's more that you form a relationship with the teacher. Whoever your local teacher is, they're not, your superior, but they are sort of like a helpful guide to help you understand your own path.
Interesting. Well, going down my long list of things to touch on, could you please describe any Buddhist holidays, if there are any?
Yes, in December 1st through the 8th, in Zen Buddhism, we celebrate Rohatsu. And Rohatsu, and this is not going to sound like a celebration, Rohatsu is a very intense period of meditation. So people will go into the Zendo and they will sit for 12 hours a day, like nonstop. You have like a 1 hour sitting and a 5-minute walking and a 1 hour sitting and 5-minute walking. And really it's to try and cultivate that same sense of like what that intensity was like before the Buddha became awake. Mm. And so we celebrate his enlightenment on the 8th, on Jodo-e, the day of his enlightenment. But there's many different celebrations throughout the Buddhist world. In spring we have Hanamatsuri, which is the celebration of the Buddha's birth. There's usually statues of baby Buddha, and he has like one hand pointing up and one hand pointing down, like basically saying that I'm the teacher of heaven and earth. And you pour sweet tea on him, just sort of very much like a kind of like a baptismal christening, sort of like, you're giving him your blessing so that in turn his teachings will become your blessing. So there's many different holidays and traditions, but it depends on the tradition, and it depends on what calendar they follow. So in Zen, they have adapted the Gregorian calendar that we know in the West, in the United States. Other traditions, like in China, they still rely on the lunar calendar, so their dates are going to be a little different, and their celebrations are different.
I'm going to take a detour because you discussed statues of the Buddha, and I'd really love to touch on where those Chinese kind of fat Buddhas came from, because every Chinese restaurant, if you know what I'm talking about, I've been in, I see him, and I've been told that if you rub his belly, he gives you good luck. Where does that come from?
So the fat chubby Buddha isn't Buddha.
Yeah, okay.
So he's sort of a folk sort of character, a folk deity, you might want to say. In Japanese, he's known as Hotei. And he's sort of part of the Taoist Chinese lineage of different like wise beings that were around. And he grants wishes, and he has like some superpowers and things. He in Buddhism, in the Buddhist understanding, he's known as a bodhisattva. So he's a spiritual being. He's awake. He's enlightened. He's around to help others, but he's not the Buddha. So. He's sort of in folk tales, you'll see him appear from time to time, and he gives like teachings and understandings to people. But yeah, he's not the Buddha. Interesting. He does supposedly grant wishes, so that rubbing the belly is sort of like embedded in the folklore.
I'd love to transition into relationships, and to begin this, this is such an elementary school question, but I guess what should you be looking for in friendships?
The Buddha, he described himself as being a Kalyana Mitra. So a Kalyana Mitra is a spiritual friend. So he didn't ever describe himself as being like, I'm the leader of this belief system, I'm the head of this thing, I'm the king of whatever. He always described himself as either a teacher or as a friend. And sort of those two things sort of mixed. And basically he was saying, if you can hang out with people that are wise, that are ethical, that are honest, that are kind and caring, like, they will teach you so much about life. However, he wouldn't say, don't hang out with people that are not those things. It's maybe you're offering your wisdom, your ethicality, your goodness to those people that need it. So, yeah, with relationships, he would say, try and find somebody out there that you can use as either a role model or as a spiritual friend who can teach you things about the way of life. And that's sort of the understanding with the teacher and student relationship in many traditions in Buddhism is it's sort of going back to the Buddha and his disciples. They're just good friends and they're learning from one another. And so the teacher is the Kalyana Mitra. He is the spiritual, or she, friend, and they are just offering what they can to help people along their path.
And then I guess, how would you describe romantic relationships? Are they along the same lines?
Oh, so I just finished a paper on this, actually, so it's very interesting. Buddhism, he doesn't have any sort of yes or no about whether it's good or bad. He does talk about, marriage is just defined by the culture. So he didn't really have a definition of it, is it just between heterosexual couples? Is it, none of that is ever answered. He's like, if you want to commit yourself to somebody, that's fine. That might turn into either a hindrance or a help later on in life. It just depends on what the relationship is. But he did say, he described everything this way, sort of. If you have a relationship that's ethical, that's kind, that's honest, that's compassion, rather than it being this just intense lust or this intense attraction, or, you're just sort of friends but nothing else is going on. That wasn't really talked about. He was more concerned about your behavior and your honesty and your compassion. So with romantic relationships, I would say it's the same thing. You're really looking for a partner that's going to help you along in your life, whether that be in a spiritual aspect or not. But life is very difficult, and it's difficult to go through some of the things that happen in life alone. So it's good to have somebody in your life that you can be honest with and just talk about things and help you figure out things. So I would say that would be along the same lines.
Going on from relationships, I wanted to touch on children for a moment, because I know this may be a very outlandish scenario, but if everyone were to become a celibate monk, but not all of us were to become enlightened, I guess what might that mean for the human race, and what of us if our human incarnations become extinct?
Well, the human race is sort of in our dominant perception and our attention because, that's who we are as people. Yes. But within the Buddhist cosmology, right, within the universe understanding, there's different beings out there. So other than humans, you also have animals, and then you also have beings that are trapped in hell. You have gods and angry gods. So the gods are not immortal, like the way we would understand gods. They're sort of like these celestial beings. They're sort of described as angels. They have really, really, really long lives, but they aren't prone to escaping rebirth. Mm-hmm. So they may have been people that have done a lot of good in the world and have really changed the lives for people for the better. And so when they die, because of all this good merit that they've accumulated through their life, they're reborn as one of these celestial beings. Well, these celestial beings are just up there in these palaces and they're having this great time. Well, eventually that ends. They too will die and will be reborn. The angry gods also have a lot of privilege, but they don't have as much, right? Yeah. It's sort of like, middle-class America. We have a lot of privilege. We have clean water, we have cars, we have all this access, we have internet, we have all these things, but we wish we had just so much more. Right? Yeah. We wish we were Jeff Bezos, being able to fly in a rocket and whatever it is. So there's always this anger and this jealousy with the gods that have more. And then there's also hell beings. They're basically all the horrible things that they've done in life have put themselves in this position where they're just trapped. And Buddhist hell, like all the other realms, you're there, you live there for a while. Once your karma has burned up, all the deeds have been reconciled, then you can be reborn somewhere else. The other thing about Buddhist hell is that there's a fiery and a frozen. There's not just this lake of fire, there's also a freezing hell. And then the other realm is hungry ghost. And hungry ghosts are these beings that are emaciated. They're just starving to death. They're so hungry that their bellies have bloated. Their insides are trying to digest themselves. And they're these ghoulish sort of like dark figures. Their skin is gaunt. They're ashen colored, and they have these really thin necks. They can't barely maybe squeeze a grain of rice down, and everything they eat turns into like molten ashen fire in their mouth, and they're just constantly hungry for things that they can't have. And it sort of reminds me of people that have very strong addiction. They're after this thing, and it doesn't matter. Anything else in the world doesn't matter unless they have their craving. So there's all these different realms that are going on. So even if somehow, miraculously, all of the human race decides, let's all embrace this philosophy, let's all become enlightened, there's still so many other beings around in the world that we need to take care of.
That's fascinating. I had no idea. It reminds me a lot of Dante's Inferno. Well, I wanted to discuss political engagement a little, and I suppose my question would be, what role, if any, should politics play in our lives, and should we be politically active from a Buddhist point of view?
Well, they largely have stayed out of it,
That's what I was wondering.
It's sort of, they allow people to make decisions in their life, and sort of that freedom to decide for yourself what's good or bad is sort of the attitude around politics, Now, there is sort of this active, more societal, sort of engaged Buddhism where people are starting to realize, this individual path, even when you're in community, like at the Lincoln Zen Center, isn't addressing or wanting, all of the issues that we have going on in life. There's so much harm being done at the governmental level. There's policies are coming in and they're going to change everything. Well, I think the Buddhist answer would be like, how can you play your part in there that's kind and caring and compassionate? How can you become a good friend to others and teach them more about these things in a kind, caring, compassionate way? And so there's ways of addressing it, but there's never going to be, I don't imagine there's ever going to be like a Buddhist senator at the end.
Yes.
It would be very difficult, I think, for them to hold to their spiritual beliefs and practices and still go into that realm where there's so much going on that's just dishonest, or where they have to compromise so many things in order for things to happen and work. So they would say, it's just like everything else in life. How are you engaging with it? How are you working with it?
Yeah. It seems to me that for a lot of people, politics really becomes not a fight for what's right or wrong, but just another form of consumerism.
It's very, it's polarizing is what it is in our country right now. You can't be associated with this side because then you become the entire characteristic, all the traits that makes them that bad person, right? So, if you're a liberal and you see people not wearing a mask, or you see them, whatever it is that makes them seem like such a conservative, like that turns into such like a connotation, it's such an evil thing to be. And really, people are very complex. We don't have any idea of what their beliefs are, or maybe they forgot the mask in the car or anything, but we have this whole storyline like ready to deploy. Like we can judge them instantly and dislike them instantly without even really knowing anything about them. So, like everything else in life, I would say it's a complex matter, and the only way to know it is you actually have to know them. You have to get to know them, and there's going to be aspects of them that you don't like, and there's going to be totally many aspects that you're going to be like, that's exactly the same things that I believe and hold to be true.
Yes, it's fascinating. We're really reaching the end of what I wanted to discuss of life. I guess, could I ask you for maybe one piece of advice for people looking to be more mindful or compassionate in their daily lives?
Yeah, it's really, work with one moment at a time and really be kind and compassionate with whatever arises. You are going to always be in a situation, and you're always going to have a relationship with that situation. And if your entire life goes on with finding yourself in horrible situations and reacting in ways that make it worse, that's going to be really painful. It's going to be really a lot of suffering that you have to endure. But if you find yourself in painful situations and you relate to it as best you can with some kindness, with some quietness, with some compassion, with some acceptance of what it is rather than what it could be or what it should be or whatever it is that you would like it to be. Things might be a little less bad. And that little less can start to shift things in your mind, and you can start to see things in a new way. So I would say this is a slow process, and to treat yourself and others as kindly as possible.
Could you please tell me how you yourself have come to Buddhism and how it's influenced your life?
So I grew up Catholic, but we weren't, super Catholic. We weren't like going to Mass every Sunday, but it was part of my upbringing and understanding. And I just didn't buy it like at age 12. I was like, I don't think this is, 100% true. So I started looking at different religions and spiritualities probably in high school. After age 12, I was just like, I'm just not talking about it. I would say I was atheist.
Yes, yeah.
But, I encountered a lot of Zen teachings, a lot of Buddhist teachings, and it really, like, the understanding about, loving kindness towards every being and having the capacity and the agency to really move yourself out of these difficult situations, it was really appealing to me. So I really studied it for a while at high school and then in college. And, college age, I was like, I think I really like and understand this Zen thing. So I started looking into it more in depth, and I started attending meditation and really understanding it. And it really helped my life become a lot better. I'm a gay man, and I was closeted at the time, and I was overweight, and I was miserable, and I hated my career, and I hated all these other things in my life. And meditation really forced me to stay with those situations and really try to understand them and embrace them. And it's like, you can't escape what this thing is. You can't escape who you are. So with that understanding, it's like, if you just be yourself and just accept that self as it is and just love that self, then you'd be so much better. So that's what I did. I came out and I've worked on the relationships after that for a while. I think my parents were very accepting and many people were very accepting. But, the biggest part of all of that is, how am I accepting of myself? I think that's a big part of many people's coming out stories. And then, with the ethicality, with the, trying to do good things with other people, feeling so much better, I started to eat better. I started to learn to take care of myself better. I started to see my spiritual needs as being important. And so, I lost probably 80 pounds and I started to enjoy life again. And I started really taking pride in teaching and enjoyment in it. And then, I met my partner and then I moved here to Lincoln. And I really felt like this is a very important aspect that's being missed in American culture and understanding. We're very secular, which is, it's good and bad, right? It has its pros and cons. But I think a lot of people are filling their spiritual needs with materialism, as we've talked about. And, that's fine for a while, but after a point, it becomes very toxic and it just feeds itself. So that's where I really decided that I want to take my teaching into a different way. And I looked into spiritual care and chaplaincy and really thinking about how can I deepen my practice further. And, Zen priest and chaplain came to mind, and Naropa University is where I'm attending. It's one of the only Buddhist-inspired universities in the country, and as a Master of Divinity program, and I'm like, I think I would love to do that. I'd also love to teach this like at a university level where it's more accessible to people if they don't feel like they necessarily want to be Buddhist, they just want to learn about it. So that's a little bit about my background and how I came to the tradition. It's just, when I read some of the sutras and I looked at some of the understandings, it was a feeling of like being at home. This finally makes sense, and I finally understand what this is about.
Wow. How often do you practice meditation or try to practice meditation?
I practice every day. I try and do at least half an hour. Because of classwork, I'm taking, courses in meditation. that's probably extended. So this morning I did some sitting practice, some basic zazen, and then there's this Maitri loving kindness practice that I'm working on that takes me about an hour, between the different stages of it. So I try and practice at least a little bit every day. There's some days where I don't, and that's totally fine. I just, I'm doing whatever it is that I'm doing. And it's okay. You can practice meditation in ways that are not just sitting practice. You can be mindful while you're driving or you're cooking in just everyday activities.
Can you talk a little bit about the career that you're after at Naropa University?
Yeah, so, what I really enjoyed about teaching, and I taught middle school math for a long time, was not necessarily that I was good at teaching math or that I really liked math as a subject, which is, those are true, but I really liked working with people. I really liked trying to help some of these kids understand what's important in life and try and give them a better understanding of yes, these people are terrible right now, but it's not going to matter in 10 years. You're going to be so much better. You're going to be such a better place. You're going to have so many more experiences. And really that led me to think, well, the math part could go or come, that's not as important as really working with people. And what I was really doing in those situations was I was providing a lot of guidance and spiritual care. It's just under the guise of being a helpful teacher. And so that really led me to think, well, if I could do that for people, teenagers in a middle school, I can probably work with a number of different people. And I really enjoy talking and meeting with people and helping them find meaning and understanding in their own lives, whatever it is, and working with them with that.
Is there anything else that you'd like to share about your own experiences?
I would just say, my partner is a Lutheran, so we come from a sort of a mixed faith household. And one of the other things that I really enjoy about my program is that it's very interreligious. I'm learning a lot about how to communicate meaningfully across different spectrums of belief and whether somebody doesn't have any beliefs at all, So I would say that spirituality is not so much like a check the box sort of category. You might have different beliefs across a spectrum of ideas, and it's okay to feel like you belong to different traditions or different parts of different traditions.
Are there any challenges present with living in a household with two theologies?
People often wonder if there's a lot of tension or arguments about what's right and what's wrong. It's we don't approach those sorts of conversations with this is the right, this is the truth, this, you're right, I'm wrong. That sort of idea. It's more like an offering, this is what Christianity has to say about these sort of things. And, my partner Peter he'll tell me a little bit about that sort of that viewpoint and help me understand why a Christian would want to, focus on such and such issues or a way of understanding this part of life. And I will say a little bit about how I would view that. And, surprisingly, there's a lot of overlap. There's a lot of overlap in finding compassion, kind, and caring ways of engaging in the world, as one would imagine in spiritual traditions. So we sort of offer those things to one another, and there hasn't been any sort of arguments. I think that largely it's a part of, we're both spiritually mature people, and knowing that other people have different ways of engaging things is important. I do attend church with him every once in a while, and he's interested in meditation, but he hasn't quite taken the plunge yet, so we'll see how it goes. But yeah, it's not so much like we compromise on things, it's just that we have different ways of looking at the same thing.
Entering the discussion of death, I'm really interested to see how Buddhists view death and how maybe you feel about the West perception. I've personally found the West view is very fascinating to me. It seems really like we like to ignore it until it happens, which obviously it does, and then when it does, ignore it some more. My father passed away the summer after my 6th grade year, and it seemed that the time for acceptable grieving was over in the blink of an eye. And then I spent the rest of my youth trying to bend over backwards to make other people comfortable with my own father's passing when, the conversation would come up. Or better yet, just sweep it under the rug and pretend like it never occurred at all, because it's a terribly uncomfortable subject to many people. I mean, in a way he had passed on, but in another way it seemed like he had never been there at all. So I'm very interested in seeing how Buddhists perceive death and dying.
I think in the West, we're largely a secular country now. It's very rare actually to find somebody that still holds tight and fast to like a Christian belief. There's sort of an understanding that, when you pass, maybe you look exactly like you did in life and you go into heaven and it's this wonderful paradise, and sort of that, maybe naive, immature, not quite developed understanding of heaven when, the actual biblical text is a little different. But you contrast that to like a secular understanding where you're just like out, you're just like gone and there's nothing afterwards, you're just deleted. And for Buddhists, death is on the mind all the time. They're like, one of the common phrases is like, the evening verse, for example, in the Zen tradition is awaken, awaken, take heed, do not squander your life. You could die at any minute, so don't waste any precious moment. All these moments are precious. Try and wake up as much as you can. And so it really puts this sort of, it's not a pressure, but maybe a tension on using your life well and meaningfully, but understanding also at the same time that you could be gone just like that. And that really frightens a lot of people, and it really makes Buddhism seem like it's a very pessimistic sort of tradition. And it's really saying there isn't going to be moments that you think you're going to have. Whatever the moment is right now, really treasure it, because if that next moment comes and you're not in it, that could definitely happen.
Yeah.
So it really wants you to make meaning in your life and really pay attention to what matters in the here and now, rather than sitting there fantasizing about all the free time that you could have had if you did such and such a thing, or you bought such and such an app, or whatever it is, So with death and dying, I really like Thich Nhat Hanh's understanding about interconnectedness, and interconnectedness is a really big part of Buddhism. It's, when you are looking at a cup of tea, for example, is what he classically uses. The tea is made out of various things, right? You have tea in there and you have water. Well, the water came from something. It came from clouds, and those clouds came from the ocean. The water from the ocean evaporated and became the clouds. The clouds rained down, and then they fell into the earth, and they flowed into the water. So you have no idea where this water even came from. It's just everywhere, and it's at all places at all these times. And the tea, same thing, it came from the earth and it formed into these tea leaves, and it was plucked by these people, and these people had to package it and send it to you, and it's touched like all these different hands. It took all these different, countless people, countless beings to actually get this tea to you. And here you are just enjoying this like mundane, this everyday cup of tea. And really the entire universe is sitting there in that cup.
Yeah.
And I feel like it's the same thing with people. You and I are one part of this constantly emerging, growing constellation of interrelated people, beings, dialogues, ideas. All these things that are forming in the universe are all coalescing and condensing into these moments that are what we call me and you. And they don't ever really disappear. They change shape, they transcend, they become other things, but they don't disappear.
Mm-hmm.
So, with whoever passes away, their memories, their responses, their actions, all of those things are passed into the world. Their physical body is gone. The Buddhists would say that their consciousness is now somewhere else. But they never have left, because if they have left, there wouldn't be a way for anything else to exist.
Mm.
You are here because I am here, and I am here because you are here. We are interrelated. Thich Nhat Hanh would call this interbeing. we enter are. And so with that understanding in mind, death is just an event where this understanding of what is reality is ended and something else is passing in the next moment. When really at this more cosmological level, it's just a transformation. It's a moment of transformation. It's startling. It's immediate. It's sometimes frightening. But it's just a transformation. And wherever and however these people, these beings are, I hope that, the merits that we as kind and compassionate people have benefited them and that they can overcome suffering.
Some of us don't get the privilege of knowing when we're going to pass away, but some people get that, a doctor saying, well, you have about 3 months to live.
Right.
I suppose, what would a Buddhist say, or if a Buddhist got that news, where do they go from there?
This goes back to our talk about, you're always in relationship with something. And here you're in relationship with death. Death is going to be a part of your life, whether you want it or not. So it's similar, like everything's similar, right? It's similar to meditation. You are working with this concept of death. You're working with this experience of death. You're working with all of these bundled up emotions around death. Your fear, your anger about it, your sadness. Maybe you're excited for death. Maybe life hasn't been so great, and you're just like really wanting to see what the other side is like. You work with all those things the same way you do with meditation. You really understand them. You feel them. You become them. You look at them and observe them and see how they're affecting your decisions. And then you embrace them. You come to the understanding that if I have to die, at least I can die with some dignity. I can understand what the situation is like for other people. I can have some compassion for everybody who has ever died on this planet. And then you don't feel so alone. And when you don't feel so alone, when you're in a community of people that have died and have had this experience since time beginningless, it doesn't become such a tense, frightening event. It just becomes a moment of transformation. So I'd say that whether they think they're doing it or not, many Buddhists, when they practice meditation, they're sort of practicing for death.
Is there anything else you'd like to share with those who are interested in Buddhism? Maybe those who wish to get more involved?
I would say there's many really good resources out there if you're interested. One is Thich Nhat Hanh's book. It's called The Heart of the Buddha's Teachings. And it covers sort of like the foundational aspects of what the faith tradition is about. And he does so in a really poetic and engaging and really wonderfully easy to read style. And I'm actually going to lead a book study with the Lincoln Zen Center. If you go to their website, lincolnzencenter.org, you can see more details about that, and you can email us if you have any questions. The other thing I would say, is do more reading. Read Thich Nhat Hanh's book. Practice some meditation. There's excellent videos out there on how to get started, and you don't need anything except for maybe a chair. And if you want to stand or if you want to lay down, there's postures for that. But the most important thing I can advocate for is go out and find somebody to practice with. Either a center or a community or a teacher, but go and find community and learn and understand meditation and Buddhism from people that have studied it and practice with it. It's very easy to find some sort of Facebook post or meme or rant on the internet, and then suddenly your whole idea about karma or Buddha is warped in some sort of way. And that is just the nature of the world. But if you go out and practice with people that have engaged and practiced before, that's different. That's more truthful. So that would be my advice.
Is there anything else you'd like to share?
No, it's been wonderful.
Yes,
thank you
it
all
has.
for listening, and may you be free to experience the bliss of not having to suffer. May you have loving kindness in your life. May you one day become awake.
Thank you very much.
Don't waste your lives, practice meditation.